Hello everyone, and welcome to this fourth webinar in our Climate Change, Fire and Biodiversity webinar series, Valuing and Managing Carbon-Rich Systems. My name is Rachel Morgan, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands from which we're broadcasting and attending today. I'm privileged to live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra and the surrounding regions, and I'd like to acknowledge their custodianship of this country since time immemorial and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of giving priority to Indigenous custodianship of country, particularly taking a moment to remember that custodianship in asking how we can make right and how we can manage impacts on climate and country by thinking through what traditional owners have been able to do in caring for this country. I'd also like to welcome particularly any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. This is the final in our webinar series, as I said, which is a jointly hosted series by the National Environmental Science Programme's Threatened Species Recovery Hub and Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub. The series has aimed to bring together climate change and biodiversity research in a way that can help understand how working together we can improve how we manage, plan and adapt our natural systems in the face of climate change. You can view the rest of the webinar series at a link which will be posted in the chat in a moment. And we will also have a recording of this webinar series available to you then. And to you, the audience, we'd now like to hear from you in the chat. Tell us which organisation you're from and what Indigenous country you're coming to us from today. So you'll find the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we'll need to select all panellists and attendees to introduce yourselves. Please take a moment to do so now. And while you're all doing that, I'd like to ask you to, I'd like to now introduce our silent facilitator, Sonia Bloom. She'll be helping facilitate from the background and posting you links and information. So in addition to the chat function, you should also see a button for Q&A down the bottom of the screen. By clicking on this button, it will bring up a panel where you can ask questions throughout, at any point throughout the webinar today. And I will put some of those questions to our speakers and panelists in our panel discussion during the second half of the webinar. You'll be able to see and like each other's questions. So we're expecting quite a lot of questions from our large audience today. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible, but please do go ahead during the discussion and upvote any questions that you think are particularly important, and we'll prioritise getting to those. So I see people coming in today, and welcome to all of you from around the country, from Wiradjuri country, from Kaurna country, from Wurundjeri country, up in Yugara and Bundjalung country. Thanks everyone, and please from the Nyungar Nation, please do continue to introduce yourselves while I start us today. So we'll send, just to let you know, any questions we don't get to today in the discussion, we'll be sending around a resources pack afterwards, and this will include answers to those questions which we're not able to cover today. So please don't panic too much about that. I'd like to move straight now to introducing all of our speakers, and I'll begin with our first speaker, Pep Canadell. So Pep is Chief Research Scientist at CSIRO and Executive Director of the Global Carbon Project. PEP leads the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub's project on Australia's carbon budget, and his work focuses, among other things, on the sources and sinks of the main greenhouse gases and on abrupt ecosystem changes and collapse due to rapid climate change. PEP is here to introduce our topic today, and he'll be speaking to us on the world of carbon budgets and the importance of carbon in biodiverse systems. So I'll hand over to you now, PEP.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to begin by just thanking the NES Hubs for organizing this interesting panel and the opportunity, of course, to be part of it. So I want to begin by leaving you with my three take-home messages that I hope they're going to be themes that they're going to be recurrent, throughout the entire discussion today. The first one is that the biosphere is a critical regulator of atmospheric CO2. And what I mean by that is that anything we do to the biosphere either protect stocks and flaxes, enhance them, or for this matter, to decline some of the stocks through human activity will have a critical impact on the CO2 in the atmosphere and therefore in the climate, which we try to protect. There's no better piece of data to demonstrate how important this thing is than the understanding that we have globally that for every ton of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels, about 300 kilos of it is taken by the terrestrial vegetation. So you think about, in a way, as a 30% climate change discount to the impacts, which certainly we can use given the rapid progression of climate change. The second key message is that disturbance regimes are changing and are changing quite quickly. The reason disturbance regimes are important is because they determine, the amount of carbon stock that ultimately you can have within an envelope of climate and the composition of biodiversity that can deliver that service, in terms of carbon uptake. So when we begin to think about, projects and ways to protect and to enhance those carbon stocks, we really need to think about how these disturbance regimes are changing and are changing quickly due to climate change and interacting with a lot of things that we already do to the land. And we'll talk about this thing more. The third and final one is that not all carbon is equal, neither for biodiversity, which is an obvious thing, but nor for the climate. So we can have a kilo of carbon in a field of Patterson Curse of wheat, or we can have a kilo of carbon into, an ash, mountain ash trunk. And although from a climate point of view, it doesn't really matter where that carbon sits, both for biodiversity, which is obvious, do not say anything about the two kind of species, but also for climate and what we call the residence time of that carbon away from the atmosphere. It is critical, and ultimately for the permanency of carbon stocks, which is a must if we are to protect our climate, it makes also a big difference. So both, as I said, biodiversity and climate, not all carbon is equal, so we're not just looking at the carbon accounting per se. So let me just kind of move and show you just a little data to support the first two claims particularly. This is the Australian carbon budget. And although it becomes quite complex, not fully shown here, I just want you to kind of see the numbers in the red circles. First of all, we're emitting last year about 106 million tons of carbon of fossil fuels, emission CO2, and carbon, that's carbon. And also very interesting that very few people know that we actually emit on average almost the same amount, through fire every single year, not just last year. Last year was probably 200 or more million tons of carbon, but just as an average. And notice that there is a bit of an exclamation mark in the fire, because traditionally we've been accounting this fire as that kind of emits into the atmosphere but gets reabsorbed over the coming years, through regrowth of savannas and forests, something that, now begins to be questioned as to whether it is really true anymore. I want to show also in the vegetation and soils, we have estimated with large uncertainties that the Australia vegetations and soils are actually actively sequestering carbon at a rate of probably as much as 85 million tons of carbon per year. There are many processes involved, but the point that I'm trying to make here is the fact that you could potentially equivalently almost remove a third of all fossil fuel emissions we're emitting just through what the vegetation does, and the fact that those opportunities within vegetation and soil are plentiful to continue this activity or this process of removing and counteracting, offsetting so much of the fossil fuel emissions, which creates largely the climate problem. Australia also has this incredible endowment of coastal ecosystems, which we call blue carbon. And, they store also very large amounts of carbon, and most importantly, they're active sinks. So, there could be could be uptaking as much as 8 million tons of carbon per year, which again, you could look at it as offsetting 8% of all fossil fuel emissions that's coming out from Australia's use of fossil fuels. Now, I want to kind of go back immediately to what I just said before about that disturbances are changing and are changing very quickly. This is the probability of marine heat wave days already at 1 degree, which is exactly where we are now. So over the last 40 years, we had already seen a doubling of the marine heat wave days affecting those ecosystems that you just saw, those large carbon stocks. And even at 2 degrees, we don't need to go to 3 or 4 degrees, even at 2 degrees, the expectation is that, and these are among the most robust things that we know in terms of ocean, they're going to be as much as 22 times bigger, many more marine heat wave days than we had pre-industrially. So again, when we are going and start moving and thinking about, the projects and how we can bring that additional carbon stock up to increase the sinks, we need to place this now in a context of resilient ecosystem resilience and how we think disturbance regimes are changing. And again, more on disturbances, this is the fire return interval in places where there have been fires. And if you look at the left panel in the 80s, it was dominated by blues and reds, indicating many decades in between fires and some reds as we move into the south. Look now in the last decade, and we see that there is a dominance of red and very red as we go south into Victoria. So again, incredible changes in the fire regimes, which will, no doubt about, have an impact in the way we manage, we design the conservation, the protection and enhancement of those carbon stocks. So I'll leave it here and just with the 3 key messages, and I'm sure that this thing will permeate through the discussions and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pep. It's great to hear from you. So our second speaker is David Lindenmayer, and David is a globally renowned ecologist at the Australian National University and Deputy Director of the the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. He has over 30 years experience working in the forests and woodlands of southeastern Australia, and he'll be talking to us today on forest carbon measures and opportunities. So just while David's speaking, I just want to remind everybody we've now closed the chat, and but you're welcome to post questions in the Q&A at any point throughout the speaker's talk. So over to you, David. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Is that talk set up okay now?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about forest carbon measures and opportunities and briefly skip across quite a number of years of insights in this space. And the focus is really on the wet forests of Victoria. So these are the forests of the Central Highlands, northeast of Melbourne. And these are really quite extraordinary forests, as you can see from this photograph of me in these forests. And some time ago, two of my colleagues, Heather Keith and Brendan Mackey, worked on some large data sets that we had gathered on the vegetation in these forests and came up with some extraordinary numbers about how much carbon there actually was in old growth mountain ash forests. So these are very fast growing forests, but very slow decaying forests at the same time. And they have a special leaf form, isolateral leaves, where the leaves hang down, and that allows many layers of vegetation to develop in the forest. So really quite extraordinary numbers and highly unexpected in terms of the potential carbon storage capacity of these landscapes. What Heather discovered was that a lot of the carbon is actually in the large old trees. And so that's actually really critical in terms of thinking about these systems. But also what was discovered was that with very large trees, you also had very large logs. And measurements of the fallen timber, which is something that's often not done with models, from many sites across the system actually showed that we had upwards of 550 tonnes of logs on the forest floor in these ecosystems. So as I said before, a lot of the carbon is in the large old trees, but the populations of those trees are declining and declining very rapidly. So a recent analysis across Victoria has indicated that that state has lost 77% of its old growth forest, where you get most large old trees, in the last 25 years. And these wet forests in the Central Highlands of Victoria are no exception. So it is possible to measure populations of large trees. They don't tend to move very far, very fast. And we can see how populations are changing over time. And the forecasts of what is happening to populations on top of the measurements that have already been made over the last 20 years are rather sobering. So we've seen approximately 90% decline. We will see about 90% decline up until 2035, assuming no more fire. And that's on top of a background level of old growth, which should be somewhere between 30 to 60% of the cover, which now sits at 1.16%. So big change in these systems, as Pep alluded to earlier. The other thing that's important is that fire is critical in these systems for regenerating these forests, but also stand replacing events. And some other work that was done, again led by Heather Keith, looking at carbon stock losses before and after the major fires in 2009, and summarised in this paper in PLOS 1, 2014, showed some quite striking results given what was happening in these systems. So what happened was that fire was burning through in some of these forests, including these old growth stands, and surprisingly, most of the carbon is still there. So with a low severity fire, Heather estimated that we had lost somewhere between 6 to 7% of the total carbon store there, and high severity fire was upwards of up to 14%. But what's actually happening is most of the carbon is still in the system, and in these fast growing, rapidly regenerating systems, you can replenish much of that carbon stock. But the intact forest systems are the ones that have the most carbon stock resilience. So human disturbance is also a major driver of change in these forests, and these systems are subject to widespread clearfell operations, as you can see from this image. And it was really important to think through what was happening to the carbon in these systems. And there are, in fact, very large emissions that come from logging and regenerating these areas. There's a large amount of logging debris in these forests, and that a lot of that debris is volatilized in the regeneration burn after the fires, and that does lead to extensive periodic industrial smoke pollution, as you can see in this photograph in East Melbourne in 2018, which has enormous human health impacts, as more recent studies have been showing. There are also very long-lasting impacts on soil carbon as a consequence of disturbance, both through fire and logging, and especially salvage logging. And so thinking about carbon storage really needs an assessment of what are the forest products that are being generated from these landscapes. And in Victorian native forests, most of the timber actually goes into the pulp and paper stream. Most of the sawn timber actually comes from plantations. And what we understand is that most of the native forest biomass that's removed from a native forest actually goes into the paper stream, and a limited amount goes into the sawlog stream. And it is possible to work out carbon budget dynamics based on that. And again, Heather has led some work looking at that in terms of the carbon stocks and thinking about native forests versus preservation in terms of carbon dynamics. And so that work really led to thinking about the economic values of the different natural assets in these forested ecosystems. And this engaged with people such as Michael Varden, who used to be at the ABS and is now at the ANU, and thinking about the different values in terms of economic and environmental accounting, particularly the United Nations SEA framework. And so this provided a platform to integrate data sets across water, carbon, timber, biodiversity, etc., and allows us to make some inferences about the relative values of the different natural assets from these forests. And this is essentially the contribution of the different natural assets to regional GDP. And this is scaled by the size of the contribution relative to the different natural assets. And we can see that, for example, water supply and carbon, plantation timber, make a significantly bigger contribution relative to, for example, to the native timber sector in this area. So essentially, economic and environmental accounting allows you to think about trade-offs in this context. So that really gives us some idea about carbon in an economic sense and its potential value in these systems. So I'm going to leave it there, but I did want to thank a number of people who've worked very hard in the field. That's Lockie McBurney and the late Dave Blair, but also carbon experts Heather Keith, Brendan Mackey, and also like to thank Rachel for instigating this process. And I'm happy for people to take my email address if they want to, and we can follow up with other material there. I can send that out to people. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And we'll also send out links and material in our resources pack to everyone who has registered for this webinar today. So our final speaker among our keynote speakers is Rowan Foley. Rowan comes from the Wanduna clan of the Budgala people, who are the traditional owners of Kagari, or Fraser Island in Queensland. He has been a park manager at Uluru. He established the Kimberley Land Council's Land and Sea Management Unit, and he is now the CEO of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation. So Rowan will be introducing us to the co-benefits from carbon investment, and also introducing ideas about a forest fire methodology. Thank you for joining us, Rowan. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I'll just stay on mute in terms of my video, just to make it easier with the brand width from Alice Springs. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, we were established around about 10 years ago. We're a not-for-profit. 90% of our work is industry development, and about 10% of our work is trading carbon credits that we refer to as either community credits or farmer credits, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Marcia Langton is on our board, and you will notice her speaking about the Rio Tinto issue and why that's relevant in terms of companies' social license to operate. Okay, next slide. I'll just speak briefly. There's two issues that I wanted to talk to today. So the first one is the co-benefits and how that's relevant. And we do have an announcement to make in terms of we've just won just satisfied a very large contract with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. So I think it's the largest trade in the voluntary market this year. And the reason why that trade was successful was because of the environmental, social and cultural co-benefits. So there is a very strong commercial and social driver that comes out of that. And the other part of that talk today is around developing a new forest fire methodology that we've been pushing for a little while now. Okay, so what we've found is there is an increasing demand in the voluntary market for the verification of co-benefits. So a lot of companies claim co-benefits, but in terms of the verification process, a lot of companies are now saying we'd like to see that. The way that we approach it, the peer-to-peer strengths-based approach, means that the process of verification is just as important as the verification itself. And I think that's a very important part of the equation. It took a long time to figure this thing out though. So next slide. We had to undertake 2 years of research and development that was funded by the Queensland government. We went through a full peer review process with all of our peers in the industry. So we did take a fair amount of time and effort to get the verification process right. Okay, next slide. In terms of how that works now in the voluntary marketplace, we're supplying 2 carbon credits, community credits and farmer credits. So the Commonwealth Bank have outlaid several $100,000 to buy community credits, and that's a multi-million-dollar deal over a number of years. And there's a number of companies now who are also looking at buying farmer credits. The 2 other financial instruments under development are offsets, so that's working with Greenfleet, so offsets with environmental, economic, social and cultural co-benefits. And the other interesting one is the cultural fire credits, and that's working in collaboration with Fire Sticks Alliance, and that's particularly focused around putting in cool burns in Victoria and New South Wales. Okay, and we're working with Griffith University on the development of that trading platform. So hopefully their students will learn a lot more about the carbon markets through that process. Next slide. So the co-benefits. So at the fundamental core of the credit is an ACCU, an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, and then it's layered with values. The most important part of this is the outside, the peer-to-peer work, farmers working with farmers, traditional owners working with traditional owners, sharing knowledge and learning from each other. So it's not some person from Sydney, Melbourne or Canberra flying in and flying out who has no relationship. Okay, next slide. We're currently being funded by a World Wildlife Fund, working with Fire Sticks Alliance in the development of a cultural fire credit. So we're hoping that they'll become available early next year. So that's, and the reason why we're developing this is because there's no methodology. So we've had to basically go out and develop our own credit because there's no methodology that's been available from the Australian government. Okay. Working with offsets, we're working with Greenfleet to develop offsets. There's a very strong international market for offsets with co-benefits, but there's also a very strong domestic market as well, and that's also under development. Actually, be in Noosa next week working on a project there. Okay, moving on. So in terms of the process, it's around skills development and training of Aboriginal rangers, so enabling local jobs to support the local economy and building the skills and talent of local people. So it's not about fly-in, fly-out consultants from down south. It's about working with the local people, building their skills and confidence to actually do the verification process themselves. If they have the right tools and the training and the support, they can do the verification. Okay, next slide. And this is what a verification actually looks like. So the training takes a week, the verification takes a week. So it's a, it's an in-depth process. It's not a light tick and flick process. And Sarah, I'm standing up in the top right, she was one of the verifiers. And in the bottom left, you also see Sarah with Jason, and they're the 2 Mapoon rangers that went to Kaunyama to conduct the verification. And like I said, it takes a week, and we video record the entire process. So it's a fairly in-depth process, but it leads to significant financial returns as well. So if you do the homework, you'll make the money, but you got to do the homework. Okay. Right. So moving on. So up north we use the Savannah burning methodology. Down south there's no fire methodology, and we believe there should be one. So just to put that into some context, the Savannah burning methodology, it did take 12 years of R&D at a cost of $10 million, led by Dr. Jeremy Russell-Smith. So it wasn't a small exercise. The methodology did encounter significant opposition, and Jeremy's more than welcome to explain that to you. Not everyone was a believer, but through hard work and persistence, it's now paid off. We use 2 computer systems, NAFI, North Australia Fire Information, and SAVBAT, to generate the offsets reports. So there's a lot of technology involved behind the scenes. But fundamentally what it does is that it turns fire management into an agribusiness. And that's the trick, that's the key. If you can get fire management into an agribusiness, more people will do it because you make money out of it. And that's the key to it. So there has been a significant reduction in wildfires in Cape York, over 50%, but you will still get wildfires. You know, it's a fire-prone landscape that we live in. You'll never reduce that entirely. And the King Review now opens up methodology development to industry. So, you know, you can develop, working with the department, you can develop new methodologies. So everyone's been focused on blue carbon, you know, for the last 5 or 6 years. And, you know, one day we will see that outcome. But, you know, in the meantime, half of Australia is burning down. So I think our priorities need to change. Okay, moving on. All right, so it's different though. We're not trying to squeeze a savanna burning methodology into a forest fire methodology. They're apples and oranges. They're two different methodologies, so people need to keep that in mind. And the reason why they're different, even though the activity is the same, is because the vegetation is different. And the last presentation about those old growth forests I thought was quite interesting. And I want to read some of those reports. The greenhouse gas emissions are different. You know, it's a different composition. There's no annual cycle like you have in the top end. So, you know, the cycle might be every 3 to 4 years. It's a different cycle. And the baseline will be different. So, you know, it's all different. And so you need to do original research and development, which will take several years. But the sooner that we get started, the sooner it will happen. And I just noted that there was a wildfire in Royal National Park just the other day. So, you know, the fire season's starting upon us again. And, you know, hopefully we'll be developing this methodology in the not too distant future. Okay, next slide. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. That's a really illustrative talk, I think, both about the importance of co-benefits and understanding integrated approaches and Indigenous-led approaches, but also more generally about the need to expand our methodologies in biodiverse carbon. So I'm going to move now to introduce each of our panellists in turn, and while I do that, I'd like to remind you all to keep posting and upvoting each other's questions so that we can get a rich discussion going when we open up to Q&A in just a moment. But before we do that, I'll introduce each of our panellists. I'm going to start with Megan Evans. So Megan joins us from the School of Business at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, and she has a wealth of knowledge in environmental policy, governance and economics. Her current research is examining the growth of private sector investment in biodiversity and natural capital. So Megan, can you please tell us very briefly about your experience working on market-based instruments for land restoration and conserving carbon-rich biodiverse systems?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for the invitation today. So yeah, generally I've spent the last 10 or so years looking at what kind of policy and economic settings are needed to incentivize carbon sequestration in landscapes, and particularly from a perspective of how to get those biodiversity win-wins associated with carbon sequestration. So I've done work as a researcher, as is my current role, but I've also worked as part of government in the Queensland government about a year ago, helping to establish the Land Restoration Fund, which has just recently had its second round of projects invested in. So I guess there's a few things I wanted to highlight. Bearing in mind that about 60% of Australia is private land, so freehold or leasehold. When we're thinking about how to increase carbon in the landscape, we need to factor in that we're actually needing to incentivize landholders and not, you know, you can't regulate necessarily people to sequester carbon in a lot of cases where there's already an existing land use. And there's a lot of things that is needed for that to happen. One of the ones that we think about a lot is a price signal. And that's something that we haven't had a clear price signal for a while, as anyone who knows the last 10 years of climate policy would be aware. But there's a whole lot of other things. So co-benefits is something that can increase adoption. And another interesting aspect is I'm interested in the roles of private and the public sector. And I think those are actually starting to change over time, as you know, Rowan kind of really highlighted before, where they've essentially gone out and started doing their own thing, largely because government has been a bit slow. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for government, but I think it's something to be aware of, that the different roles of the private and the public sectors are changing over time, and we need to better understand what those are in the future.
Thanks, Megan. So our second panellist is Paul Ryan, and Paul comes to us from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, where he leads a team providing policy advice on the role of forests and vegetation management in climate mitigation, including under the Australian Government's Emissions Reduction Fund. So Paul, can you please tell us briefly about the ERF and some of the policy context for climate mitigation through biodiverse systems?
Very sorry. Thank you. I didn't introduce myself on the chat. I'm speaking to you on Ngunnawal land in Canberra. So our department leads the Australian Government's work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, and that work includes the Emissions Reduction Fund. And that's a program that allows people to generate carbon credits, or Australian carbon credit units, as Ryan described, by carrying out projects that reduce emissions or store carbon. And they can sell these credits to the government or other buyers, which you've just heard about. So you've heard from Pep in the first part of his talk about the important role that storing carbon has in reducing emissions overall. And there's a number of ways that projects can do that under the Emissions Reduction Fund. That includes growing trees, protecting trees from clearing, managing savanna fires, which you also have just heard about, and building soil carbon. And in each of these cases, these projects need to follow a method that the government develops, and that's all around ensuring that the emissions reductions are real and genuine. These projects have been very successful to date. There are around 480 vegetation projects, and there are more than 70 savanna fire management projects, and they're located widely spread across the north of Australia. Also, as Rowan mentioned, there is now work underway on developing a blue carbon method. There is a lot of interest in that. We've looked at the different opportunities and the government's work is focusing initially on a method that would be around reintroducing tidal flows that can restore mangrove and tidal marsh ecosystems. So that's one part of blue carbon. The government's also recently announced measures to provide more new opportunities under the fund, and this includes reducing the time it takes to develop methods and more co-development as well. So the fund's focus is on large-scale emissions reductions, but as you've heard, we also know people decide to carry out those projects for a range of other reasons. There are these community benefits, and there are also biodiversity benefits. And as you've heard, and I think you'll hear more about, organisations are looking for these other benefits when they buy carbon credits, organisations outside of the government that can purchase credits. The Clean Energy Regulator administers the scheme, and they've recently made it easier for people to verify that these credits come from the sources that are identified where there are co-benefits. I also wanted to make a couple of points on the fire aspect. So of course we know Emissions Reduction Fund projects that are storing carbon could be affected by fire, as well as other natural events. And the scheme has ways to manage this built into it. One example of this is any sequestration project has a discount of 5% on the abatement to, it's essentially a scheme-wide insurance approach. Our department also develops the National Greenhouse Accounts, and that's to meet Australia's international reporting obligations, as well as tracking progress towards Australia's targets. And fire is taken into account in those accounts in ways that follow international rules and guidelines. And so that's done by taking into account the emissions as well as the sequestration in new growth over time. There's a specific provision in the international rules around taking into account large natural disturbances like we saw last summer, and countries are able to use that and that allows a way of taking into account the long run change where you count emissions and sequestration over time. This follows on well from what Pep talked about whether these things are changing. The department will also monitor the recovery of forests from fires. We're able to do that over time and take into account any changes that might be happening in that recovery cycle. And we'll be also continuing to bring in the latest science and data. There's more information on all of the things I've spoken about, and I'm happy to share that information.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. We'll now move on to introducing our third panellist, Adrian Enright. So Adrian leads the partnership strategy for Tasman Environmental Markets, the largest buyer of voluntary Australian carbon offsets. Adrian, as a buyer of carbon offsets, what do you see of the business interest in investing in biodiverse and culturally meaningful carbon offsets? And what do you see as the key motivations for the business interest in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, for the question. And I guess I've got three observations in relation to that question. And as you mentioned, we're the largest buyer of Australian offsets in the voluntary market, and sort of work with about 60 organisations. So I've got a pretty good grip on where the market's going and what the motivations are. The first observation I'd make is that the maturity around the role of offsetting in corporate strategies is really improving. I noticed a question in there about essentially don't offsets just kick the problem down the road. I think a lot of organisations are realising that offsets are an effective mechanism to do a couple of things. One, they address your unavoidable emissions now. Cars, flights, homes, buildings, these are all emissions that we're needing to address now, and we've got an opportunity to do that. Using offsets also provide a really effective carbon price to internalise within these organisations, and they actually help improve the mandate for energy efficiency, renewable energy and so on. They contextualise it for those business leaders because they now have a price internally on carbon that they're generating through offsetting. So that's what that is causing is a real maturity in the discussion and a heap of activity in the marketplace. In fact, over COVID, it looks like we'll have 2020 will be the largest year for voluntary trade of carbon offsets, and that's inclusive of a very, very active Australian marketplace. Why is that happening? Well, apart from a couple of the reasons that I mentioned and the role of risk and TCFD and so on, the organisations are seeing value in Australian offsetting beyond just the carbon. And it goes to the heart of the question here. Organisations like Qantas, the vast majority of their reconciliation action plan spanned under Indigenous enterprises is coming through awesome projects facilitated by great groups like the Kimberley Land Council and others right across Northern Australia. There's a really healthy Indigenous carbon market that was touched on by Ro before. There's a strategic advantage in being able to leverage that for other corporate drivers. SDG mapping and SDG compliance is becoming a big thing for corporates. And also linking their offsetting strategy to supply chains. So we work with a company like Lion, the big brewer, for example. They're interested in investing in revegetation projects in areas linked to their supply chain. Why? Because they understand that protecting the soil quality and waterway health is actually advantageous to their long-term strategy in producing beer and other alcoholic beverages, in addition to doing the right thing by climate change. So it's this really interesting interplay of what are the co-benefits or the strategic advantages from corporates that are driving that additional interest and driving that additional value. And what's that all doing? Well, to my third point, what that's doing is putting serious money and climate finance into great projects in Australia that are on the ground. Is the voluntary market and a market's the silver bullet to what's needed and to address the rapid change? No, but they're really, really mature and important instrument, and we're starting to see that valuation in the marketplace. A really good example of that, and you know, the likes of Megan can speak to this more, but we've seen the valuation of Australian carbon in the marketplace really jump through the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland, which actually puts a value on both the carbon and the biodiversity. And all of a sudden, you've got the average weighted price of a carbon offset being paid at about $49 a tonne. Now, to put that in perspective, the spot market trades at about $16 a tonne roughly, and higher value, high biodiverse social benefit projects are fetching in the voluntary market, you know, anywhere between 18 to 23, 24 bucks a tonne. So it's being valued in, and it's being valued for a couple of those reasons which I've touched on.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And we might come back to those questions of valuation in the Q&A in just a moment. But before we get to that, I'd just like to finally introduce and welcome Elisa Rawlings. Elisa is the Science and Planning Manager for Greening Australia's Great Southern Landscapes program. And that program, in that program, she works with others to translate academic research into best practice on the ground, to scale up programs, to explore new conservation and finance models and improve ecological impact. So Elisa, from your role in Greening Australia, what have you observed about both the key trends in biodiverse carbon in recent years and also some of the key challenges that you see lie ahead in building resilience for these investments in the face of climate change?
Thanks very much, Rachel. So Greening Australia is a national non-government organisation, and we've been planting across Australia for about 38 years. We also have a subsidiary company, Biodiverse Carbon, and we offer carbon credits to investors, predominantly for environmental planting purposes. And building on Adrian's observations, we're really seeing that nature-based solutions are in very high demand, both nationally and internationally. So today I'm going to talk from a practitioner's perspective, from an organisation that's really at the coalface of trying to mitigate both climate change and biodiversity, and we offer other co-benefits, and we really are very committed to scaling in the UN Decade of Restoration. So my first key message in response to your question, Rachel, is that carbon offsets are going to bring really new and exciting opportunities into the restoration sector that will help us mitigate biodiversity loss at scale. But if we, the sector is not really ready to maximise those opportunities at the moment. So we know that there, and there's some different points, different prices that we've discussed today, but industry sort of experts have projected an annual demand of around about 25 million carbon credits per annum by 2030, so during the UN Decade of Restoration, and a projected price of around $30 a credit, although as Adrian said, that varies over time and by project. And so that means that the restoration sector really needs to rapidly grow to be able to support a market of around $750 million per annum. So we would argue that our sector is probably not quite ready for that scale of impact quite yet, and we really need to take advantage and scale quickly. So we know that carbon, these carbon markets will pay for many of the biodiversity benefits that we're seeking as organisations, but we know that for many projects we'll also be left with a biodiversity gap in funding. So we'll need to be really smart about blending different finance opportunities so that we can maximise our biodiversity outcomes. My second key message is that our restoration sector needs to really urgently scale across all parts of our business. So the way that we work together as different organisations at the moment, we have supply chains and different finance models and technologies. And as we grow, the ones that we have at the moment are probably no longer fit for purpose. For example, we know that to supply just 10% of that market that I was talking about previously, of the projected 2030 offset market, would require access to around 250,000 hectares of land. So our land model, access models need to change. And we also know that we're going to need seed for hundreds of millions of plants by 2030. And so we've got real seed supply chain issues that we really need to overcome quite urgently. In order to scale, our sector will also have to have a really strong focus on technologies into the future, both in the way that we do business, our supply chains, and our, which are predominantly linear at the moment. We'll need to automate our on-ground delivery. We do a lot of hand planting and direct seeding, but we'll really need to start using technologies that can deliver at scale and plant hundreds of thousands of hectares across Australia. And as we talked about before, we really need to monitor and demonstrate our effectiveness at scale to these investors. Which leads me to my third and sort of final point for today, is that as a sector, we really need to improve the visibility of the biodiversity returns on their environmental investment. And I think Rowan talked about this before, that investors really want to understand what they're getting for their biodiversity dollar, particularly when they're paying more per tonne of carbon. We need to demonstrate as a sector the cost effectiveness of our different management actions, and we need to demonstrate resilience of our plantings in the longer term and in a changing climate. And that's really going to challenge us to think differently about the way that we're doing things. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Elisa. So I'm now going to open up to all of our panel and our Q&A, and we've had a wealth of questions coming in, but please keep them coming. I'd like to open with various questions we've had on the co-benefits and how we might how measure and value these. So we've heard a little bit from some of our panelists and speakers about the value that the market is already placing on many of the social and cultural as well as the biodiversity co-benefits. But in addition to the market, there's also perhaps the need to articulate methodologies to develop better measures of co-benefits around biodiverse plantings and carbon storage. So I'd like to ask our panelists to speak to that first question about where we might be at with the with this question of the voluntary carbon market and the valuing of those things, and then the kind of formalisation of that, I suppose, through various methodologies. Paul.
So yeah, a couple of comments. So I think we've heard, as you said, Rachel, really well, a lot of progress being made in a lot of areas. People like, you know, the Queensland government with the Land Restoration Fund recognising those benefits, and then a lot of other individuals in the private sector. As I said, the government's been very clear on the emissions reduction fund side that the focus is on large-scale carbon sequestration, and we are seeing people come in and developing approaches around recognising those other benefits, noting that the activities that are eligible already can deliver those benefits. We also know that there's been interest and a lot of work over a long time trying to quantify and then put a value on the co-benefits, and that's, you know, that's where the challenge is. I'll also briefly mention that our colleagues in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment are working on a new biodiversity stewardship pilot program. And so that's about rewarding farmers for management of land that provides biodiversity benefits. So there are a couple of different angles within government as well.
Terrific. Adrian.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And to back up a lot of what Paul said, and maybe Rod, I see your question in there about the Queensland fund, whether it's a driver of higher cost projects or whether it's the valuation of biodiversity. I think it's both, and what it does show also is that where there's a higher willingness to pay, it's actually bringing on board a lot of projects that weren't able or weren't feasible under a lower price, and that's terrific. That's what we need. We need that. That is the market working in its truest sense. My comments here would be that do we need to better value and measure these services? Absolutely. From a corporate perspective, that's what they're looking for when they're reporting, is to be able to evidence and identify the true impact that they're making through their investments. And I think, you know, we've heard of some really great ways of doing that. The only one caution I would say is that we have markets already, and obviously I've got a carbon bias, but we have markets operating already. We should be having a look at the current infrastructure and how we can enhance those, as opposed to necessarily adding on and creating this mosaic of new markets. My only caution on that comes from a corporate lens, whereby the discussion around, although the maturity around the role of markets in facilitating more finance into high carbon, high biodiversity is there, it's still a very opaque, confusing market. And we run the risk of trying to create the most perfect markets or perfect systems and losing a lot of interest along the way. So I think we can better work with the current infrastructure and better measure and value within that current infrastructure, which I think is starting to happen.
Yeah. Rowan?
Yeah, the thing with the LRF is that it values the operational costs. It's not the actual environmental value that when we, well, that's what we looked at when we put in the application. And that's what they came back to people on. So it's a different thing there. Look, you know, it's the argument that we make is the process of verification of co-benefits is just as important as the actual verification itself. So if you don't have data sovereignty, this is a question about farmers, particularly in Queensland, if you don't have data sovereignty, if you do not explicitly have the permission of the landholder to share the information, they simply won't engage. And that's been my experience, you know, nationally as well. So, you know, it's the principles of the work that you're engaged in that are critical to the work. You know, look, the price will go north, you know, rather than south, and more corporates want, you know, they're doing 4 things. So, you know, SDGs, RAPs, corporate social responsibility, and carbon neutrality. So they're ticking 4 boxes, not just one. And that's the more, you know, they're going to get more bang for their buck. That's what they want to do. And so if you're just doing a carbon product, you're only doing 25% of the work that the corporates want in their carbon buy. So, you know, people need to realise that.
I might bring in David here.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think one of the really important things in this space is this notion of biodiverse carbon. It actually needs measurement and monitoring so that, you know, we don't spend the next 10 years waving our arms around like we spent the last 10 years waving our arms around. The reality is that if you're going to be serious about biodiverse carbon, you actually have to measure the biodiversity. And there are some things you can't do with a satellite. You actually have to be on the ground to do that. And there are ways of doing revegetation which can actually make it worse for biodiversity. So, you know, there are some important guidelines here to make sure that we don't do that and we make it better. And there are ways to do that, but it needs to be underpinned by good monitoring. And markets are going to need that certainty that what they're investing in is actually real and it's not smoke and mirrors. So I think it's really important that we're cognizant of that, and monitoring does cost, but that's part of the process of making sure that you've got quality assurance here.
And I might just ping off that. We'll come back to some of the questions that I think Rowan and Adrian were raising about what's motivating the corporate sector into this space. But David, one of the questions we've had come through is a question about citizen science involvement in measuring carbon in forests. And I think I'm curious to hear from you and perhaps Pep and Elisa and others on the prospects for people, you know, for developing methods that could be applied by citizen scientists or community groups to being able to do those measurements.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been involved in citizen science for nearly 40 years in lots of different contexts. And by and large, the best outcomes are where there's a strong scientific framework put around it to make sure that there's some quality control and that the quality of the data is sufficient to be able to help in this space. So I think what it really needs is good scientific steering to be able to make sure that citizens are able to gather high enough quality data to be really meaningful. And so for some things, the specialty around measuring how well carbon is doing for reptiles or birds, it's going to need a high level of technical expertise. Some other things may not need the same level of scientific input, but it's still important that there's a strong scientific frame around it. So it has that credibility. So therefore, investors can have some certainty that what they're doing is actually real and making a positive difference.
Did anyone else want to comment on that? Megan? Oh, sorry, Lisa first. Yep.
Look, I just wanted to add that different investors are very smart about asking questions about biodiversity outcomes, and we really do need to demonstrate biodiversity impacts to them. They'll ask questions like, why should we move from, you know, 30 to 50 plant species, or why should we plant the understory, or why should we reinstate water regimes when you're doing the planting, and so forth. So they're asking really good questions, and we do need to find answers, and we need to make sure, as David said, that we really are having those biodiversity benefits that we're seeking. And so we're exploring both new technologies, but also, as David said, we can't always monitor everything with new technologies, and that there will certainly be a role for continuing on-ground monitoring into the future and learning by doing. I guess for me, it comes back a little bit to what the objective is, and different investors will have different levels of sort of biodiversity objectives. So some of them want some quite basic biodiversity outcomes, and that might be appropriate in some landscapes, and others are looking for much more of a complex package around biodiversity outcomes. So it's really important for us to be very clear about what the objectives are and what we're expecting to see happen at different time intervals. So not only they're not waiting to see those outcomes in 50 years, but that we can take them on a journey towards those outcomes.
Great. I think Megan, and then we'll go to you, Pep.
Hopefully that audio is a bit better. Yep, excellent. I think Alyssa and Adrian both made some really important points before in terms of, I guess, the trade-offs associated with having, and things to think about when thinking about a private sector and investor-driven biodiversity and carbon market. So obviously there's benefits in terms of innovation and speed. So the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation is a good example where they have developed their framework in close collaboration with investors and those who might, want to purchase the credits that they generate. And they've also developed a validation and verification framework that is also, socially and culturally and economically beneficial for those who generate the benefits. But then there's also trade-offs in terms of markets. There's a fundamental trade-off associated with market activity and the complexity of a metric or how much measurement you do. So the more stuff you measure and the more finely you measure and the more biodiversity you want to measure, that's going to cost more because the transaction costs are higher. So you're going to have less market activity. And that's why, if we think 10 years ago when biobanking in New South Wales first came up, that was a government-driven market. And even now in New South Wales, to come up with to measure the biodiversity benefits of doing not the habitat hectares, the biodiversity assessment framework. It's a telephone book sized, thing to go away and measure stuff. So that's why for the first, I think it was 10 years of biobanking, we only had 10 trades in that market. So there's an issue there. So benefits with having more investor market-driven approaches, but then another downside, as Adrian kind of hinted at, we end up with a lot of people, a lot of organisations, a lot of actors kind of coming up with new frameworks and new approaches in the marketplace, which is good, but then at the same time we also have investors looking for standardised metrics and approaches and coherence and complexity. So it is an interesting space where I think we're still yet to kind of settle on this new equilibrium of the different roles and contributions of the private and public sectors.
Great. And Pep, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what David was calling for, kind of more robust scientific methodologies put in place. And I may just put now words to Paul Ryan, but of course, a lot of scientists have actually contributed to the development of methodologies, at least for the carbon aspects, for the emission reduction fund. These are published, are available, and community groups could actually look at those various frameworks and try to, if they want to do something completely on their own, develop their own methodologies, but kind of trying to benchmark it against what's a more robust scientific development, which could be perhaps more complex or too complex for some citizen science involvement, but nevertheless a benchmark to be able to actually use this largely for carbon, not for all the other co-benefits.
And I just wanted to bring you back in, Rowan, on this point, because I think what you were saying before about the approach of how you do this kind of verification is just as important, particularly for Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more about how you kind of walk that line in terms of working with communities to get to have them be able to attest to and verify the various benefits, the cultural, social and biodiversity benefits of the work that they do.
Sure. Yeah, and that's, I think people confuse themselves with the role of government. It's the role of government to impose. They develop legislation, they develop policies, and they will then go and impose them on landholders. We're not the government. We work with landholders. It's the landholders who determine what they want to measure. So it's a fundamentally different approach. And, the government can knock yourself out. You can develop legislation, you can develop policies, go out there and impose them on people, stand at the farm gate and tell the farmers and everybody else what they should be doing. And, that's the role of government. We're not government. And so we took a long time, we took 2 years to figure this out. And we started down that role as well, don't worry about that, where we develop a standardized framework and then try and impose it upon people. And we quickly determined that that's just the wrong approach. So, you got to have things in there like data sovereignty. And, you have to empower people. So it's really the landholders who, the way that comes out is it's the landholders who determine what they want to measure. It's their land, it's their work, it's their projects. And then it's up to the corporates to determine whether they want to engage in that or not. And I think, look, the environmental values are, well, obviously, significant. They're only, probably 25% of the actual overall value of what we do. The very first tranche of farmer credits that we sold was because they signed an ILUA, an Indigenous Land Use Agreement. It wasn't based on their environmental credentials, although they're strong. It was based on their social credentials, about having an agreement with the local traditional owners. That's what the corporate was interested in. They had another project right next door that had strong environmental values. They decided to go with the one with strong social values. So, I think people, as soon as you talk co-benefits, everyone talks environment, and that's only one piece of the pie.
Yeah, great, thank you. I might switch sideways and bring in some of our questions on soil carbon that have been coming through at the moment. So there's a question specifically about interest in soil carbon and building soil carbon, for example, through practices like regenerative agriculture and holistic farming. But also some of the challenges that it can be difficult to measure soil carbon. So there's a question about whether there are good models available to estimate carbon storage in soil from different agricultural land management practices, but also more generally, what are the prospects for soil carbon as something that can integrate, I guess, sustainable land management practices with carbon offsets. Paul?
I can start with a few comments. So I mentioned that, so one angle on this is that you can currently undertake soil carbon projects in the emissions reduction fund, and that is around doing exactly what you just described, Rachel, improving management of agricultural land. And it's another one of those ones where there is a clear win-win, where improving management will build soil carbon and build productivity. And so there's a good driver for that. So there's some momentum building around that. It can be managed. So because it's also in our national accounts, the government does account for it at the national level. And we have data supporting that, and it's modelled as well. Under the Emissions Reduction Fund, most commonly the projects actually conduct estimates based on samples, so going out and collecting soil carbon samples. A bit like some of the previous discussion, that can be expensive, and the government's doing a couple of things, recognising the interest and the benefits in this, doing a couple of things to try and help reduce that cost. One thing is the Clean Energy Regulator, and there's information available on their website, has recently introduced a process where they will help cover some of those upfront costs. But also in the government's recent low emissions technology statement, there's a specific goal in there around reducing the costs of measuring soil carbon. So that's targeted at that national level benefit. So yes, it can be measured. The science is there and is also evolving. New types of sensors are also evolving as well that might show promise.
Great. And Rowan, is there any work being done by groups that you work with on looking at soil carbon, or is that an area that's beyond scope for you at the moment?
Oh no, it's fine. You can do the environmental, social and cultural values of soil carbon. That's fine. Louisa Kiley and Matthew Wonkin, big shout out to those guys. They really championed that methodology, particularly Louisa Kiley over many, many years. I remember her turning up to every CMI event for over several years and banging on about soil carbon, and no one took it seriously for a long, long time, I can tell you now. And then suddenly it came through, and now it's a brand new day. So the power of persistence.
Right. And Pep.
No, just very quickly, I mean, in the volunteer market, of course, there could be very simple approaches to value or to measure indirectly the carbon buildup into the soil. There's been volunteer markets elsewhere, not necessarily in Australia, where measures have not even been part of the actual, framework. And so basically we know that some key processes doing specific things to the soil lead to increase in carbon. And so there's been generic modeling just to say, if you're in this part of the country, that's what on average you would be building. And if you're somewhere else with this process, let's say no tillage, you would be built. So that's very different from the more robust, measure base. But a lot of volunteer markets around the world, they're taking no measurements. And of course, that's consistent with the carbon price, which could be maybe a little lower than if you have a system where it's measuring the actual carbon in the soil. But from a volunteer point of view, there are quite a few options which would not require necessarily, the high-tech measurements. Something different is, of course, for the government, spending the tax money, taxpayer money in trying to, fulfill their commitments on climate change, and therefore we want to make double, sure that that's what exactly is happening.
So just to build on the question about soil carbon and regenerative agriculture, I think there's a broader question about farmer-led initiatives for carbon and biodiversity projects. So would anyone like to comment on the prospects for in the farming community for leading work that can involve the integration of carbon and biodiversity? I know a few of you work in this space. Megan.
I can't say much specifically about soil carbon. I'm not a soil expert, but I'll just briefly say I think one of the perceptions or issues that I've come across a lot is this idea or a barrier being that we need to convert our whole property to carbon or to sustainable agriculture or whatever. One of the big issues in Queensland, for example, is this perception that we lock up and leave a property. And so that's a big barrier to a lot of landholders who, are worried about, pests and weeds kind of taking over. But I think what we really need to move to is, an understanding that, doing soil carbon or plantings or assisted regeneration or whatever doesn't necessarily have to take up your whole property. Think of, the property or your enterprise as a mosaic of different activities. So there might be a bit of, soil carbon over here. There might be some assisted regeneration over here. There's a portfolio of different things that you're doing on your property, which I guess is a more diverse and complex enterprise than just running cattle or having one crop. But there are benefits in terms of seeking different sources of investment from different financiers, as well as having greater resilience to external shocks. And if there's droughts, then one of the benefits of carbon offsets is that you might still be generating carbon credits while you're in drought years. So there's benefits to having a portfolio or a mosaic approach to your enterprise.
Yeah. Elisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that we work with farmers across the country, and we see that they're motivated by different things, and we've done some work with Sorrow to better understand that. And some farmers are just motivated by biodiversity alone and want to leave the place better shape that they found it in. But many are also, as Megan said, are very motivated by the productivity improvement. So it's our job to try and tie those different types of agricultural enterprises to benefits that will improve their productivity, but also have a biodiversity outcome at the same time. Because we're seeing that increasingly they are looking to diversify their income streams, and they also want to do something about offsetting their carbon impact.
David.
So Rachel, I think there's some other dimensions to this that are often missed. So Megan's comments are really spot on in the sense that farms need to be thought about mosaics. And a really good example in this space are farm dams. So this is something that we're working on in NESP and the Sustainable Farms Project. So there's over 670,000 dams in the Murray-Darling Basin alone. And about 97% of them 6 months ago were in poor condition. And dams are a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions because they fill up with shit. because they're the lowest part of a paddock. And so you get nitrous oxide, you get methane, and some estimates have emissions from carbon from poorly managed farm dams at about half the landfill sector in the country. Now, there are ways to renovate farm dams to make them better in terms of water quality. And the water quality data suggests that your average cow can put on somewhere between 10 to 23% additional weight gain by drinking good quality water. So there are actually productivity and profitability gains, but if you manage your farm dams in an appropriate way, you can get not only a biodiversity win, but you can get a greenhouse gas emissions reduction win as well. So there are ways to integrate these things that lead to really good outcomes, and some of them are things that are largely off the radar at the moment. So how many billions of dollars have we spent on breeding cows and sheep to be better or improving their pastures? How many studies are published on water quality and weight gain globally? 3. And they're all in North America. Not one is in Australia. And the cost benefit analysis that we've done indicates that the average farmer will be somewhere between 20 and 30% better off return on investment for improving their farm dams. Well, gosh, there's a massive opportunity there that's just staring us in the face to do something in terms of revegetation, carbon capture, reduction of emissions, improved productivity, better outcomes for farmers. Well, gosh, let's do it. And, you know, I think the exciting things that can happen here, and it doesn't mean that people have to leave the land. Yes, it means they have to change the way they manage things. Yes, it means we have to measure some stuff and document it, but, you know, there'll be good outcomes, and having the evidence to show that, I think, is really an important part of this whole process.
Right. So I might just, we've got time for just a couple more questions, and I might just come back to some of the earlier questions that got asked, because I think these are really important. There's a specific question on whether there's been any modelling or foresight on how we can work with the changes expected in the coastal wetland fringes as sea levels rise, not only for relocating flooded infrastructure, but also for growing and expanding the wetlands carbon sinks and fisheries nurseries and so on. So, but I think I want to open that up more broadly to ask a few of our people who might be experienced in this space to tell us a bit about the thought being given to climate adaptation of our carbon-rich, biodiverse, culturally important landscapes, and how we might get better, or what we need to do to strengthen our capacity to build resilience in our systems. Elisa, did you want to start us off there?
Thanks, Rachel. And I guess I am actually, my background's in wetland ecology, but I can't comment too much about the coastal wetland specific example. But I guess one of the great things about carbon offsets is that they mean that we're tied to that offset financially and legally for 25 to 100 year periods. And that means that we really need to think carefully about making sure that those stocks are resilient in a changing climate. And so I guess we've been thinking a lot about that. How do we, so as Paul said, there's some compensatory measures and approaches in some of the methodologies to think about things like bushfire risk and what happens in those regards. But ultimately, we don't want to lose the things that we're putting into the landscape. So we're spending a lot of time, it's really challenging us to think about new approaches, such as the use of climate-adjusted seed, so seed collected from hotter and drier locations, species substitutions, where species are no longer viable in those landscapes in a warming future, so we can sort of use a lot of climatic models to understand what the future looks like, and we think about things like plant traits and how likely they'll be able to persist and recruit in a changing climate. And we're also working with fire ecologists to think about bushfire risk mitigation and how we can be really smart about that in a changing climate, because that's a very big risk for us.
Great. Adrian?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think from a buyer side of the offsetting too, I mean, you're starting to see organisations enter into 10, 15, 20, 30-year agreements. They want to see that their investments in those projects and the supply of that carbon is robust and resilient against future climate impacts. So from that angle as well, I think there's a real need to make sure that what we're doing in that space is exactly what Elisa was saying, adaptive to future climate conditions. I think bringing in something that Paul mentioned and touched on in his presentation as well, there's a significant amount of interest in blue carbon, not only because of the carbon sequestration potential, but also of the adaptive capacity that restoring coastal ecosystems has on property value. So the quicker that we can speed up the transition of those markets and those methodologies into this space, I think we're going to see that dual investment into both adaptation and mitigation, and organisations are certainly signalling their investment to their opportunity to back it. So I'd be confident that we're going to start seeing more of that investment go into those sorts of projects as well.
And Pep, did you want to add something there?
No, I was just going to add that, I mean, one thing that I think that people are beginning to, well, that's very old in ecology, but kind of appreciating that building ecosystem resilience, it's becoming a really critical thing in the thinking of how we want to, for instance, a blue carbon project to move forward in the face of, for instance, marine heat waves. And the first thing that, of course, this would require is to look at all the other stressors that those ecosystems might have, like whatever, overfishing, reduce sediment loads, reduce a lot of the nutrient runoff, all the things that are additional stressors. And for the land is exactly the same. David was talking about, forestry in places where ultimately you increase the fire risk. So in a way, when I think that we move into these bigger projects, thinking about these timeframes of 20, 30, 40 years, the first thing that it is important is to look at really building that ecosystem resilience, which would immediately look at all the other stressors and try to diminish those stressors. We can do very limited on the climate change front from a project level, not from a global society. But I think that those are things that would not just kind of avoid necessarily the impact, but also enable those ecosystems to kind of rebuild after major, abrupt changes.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask for a couple of comments in closing, really around this question of how business interest and policy work can be better aligned to motivate this space. So there's been a few questions on how genuine the business interest is in this space. So perhaps Adrian, you could pick up on that. And also questions back to you, Rowan, about what we can learn, for example, from the development of the Savannah carbon burning methodology in looking forward to developing new methods for other systems. But I might just start with Adrian to kind of make that comment about where the corporate sector is at and where it could go and how that could align with policy.
Yeah, I think from what we're seeing in the marketplace, I could sum it up in one word: risk. Climate risk is on the radar of every board, of every executive management team, and they're starting to realise that if they're not responding to that risk, whether it be through compliance instruments like TCFD or otherwise, whether it's coming from customer pressure, staff pressure, shareholder pressure, then they are accountable and liable not only now but into the future. I think that's a clear pivot that we've seen, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months. Are we going quick enough? I don't think anyone would agree that we are. But however, the tide has turned. We're seeing it in the level of market activity. Could there be more alignment with policy? Absolutely. We've got to remember that corporate Australia are working in a 10-year decade of policy uncertainty, and I think they're starting to manage that uncertainty and turn it into a language that they know very well, and that's managing risk. That's where we see it going forward. That's why we're very confident in the level of activity that's going on at the moment. Is there more that needs to be done? Absolutely. Is it down to shifting from lowest cost abatement through to higher cost abatement? No, it's about abatement. It's about everything on that spectrum that needs to happen right now. And the quicker we get on with that, the better off we'll be.
Great. And Rowan, what do you think the key lessons are from the work on the Savannah carbon methodology for developing new methods in this space?
The key message is if you do the R&D, do the research and development, then you'll get the outcomes. And so we need the investment in research and development. Look, it did take a long time for it to be developed, but it's there now. Everyone's making a lot of money out of it in Northern Australia. But more importantly, we've seen a reduction of fires by 50% in Cape York. So that has been measured. And you know, we can buy the RFS down in New South Wales and Victoria as many bright, shiny trucks as you want. Until you start getting in and burning the forest according to the principles of the traditional owners, you're not going to get the wins on the board. So it's a bit like new answers at the bottom of the cliff. You can provide as many ambulances as you like, but you need to be working at the top of the cliff. You need to stop people from going over in the first place. And, you know, hopefully we'll start to work on the method. It will take a number of years. It's not going to be easy. It does to work. But, you know, in 3, 4, 5 years' time, we could have a methodology that says, yes, we have a 50% reduction in bushfires in New South Wales now. Who would have thought that 5 years ago? You know, we can make those statements. So, but we need to start the work now.
All right, and I think on that hopeful note, we might close there. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your contributions in terms of the questions as well as in terms of the people providing the discussion for us today. Both of our hubs have ongoing webinar series where we'll continue to share our work and the work of our partners on biodiversity and climate research, partnerships with traditional owner communities and others. So please keep an eye out on our websites for details of future events, and they are being posted in the chat at the moment. We'll now open the chat back up for final thoughts and comments for you. And just a reminder that we'll be sending around a resources pack, including questions, answers to many of the questions we didn't get to today in coming weeks with resources on this topic. We'll also be providing a video link to this video for anyone you know who's missed it. So please keep your eye out for all of that material, and thanks again for joining us and for contributing to a great discussion today. We're going to be putting a link to our feedback form that will come up when you leave, so please do fill out our feedback form, which can help us to understand the issues important to you and how we can run these events better in future. But thanks once again to all of our speakers, to all of our panelists, and to all of you, our audience members, for a great webinar. It was a great pleasure to hear the discussion and to flesh out these issues with all of you. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.